Gone back to that those who work in design.
Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James. I work for the foundation, and all I'm really going to do this evening is the housekeeping announcements, which are as follows. If there is a fire alarm, you shouldn't use the lift, although it does work now. It was broken until yesterday, so you had a narrow escape from climbing up all our stairs. But anyway, you have to go down the stairs if the fire alarm goes off and not in the lift. And then we should then congregate on the park side of the street downstairs. And the second thing is don't leave any valuables in our cloakrooms downstairs because nobody is monitoring them. So if you haven't left a laptop or anything like that in a bag, I suggest you just pop down and pick it up and keep it with you. So that's all the housekeeping. And tonight we're going to talk about Japanese design for tea ceremony. And we're launching Michael Freeman's new book. He is a photographer, a very well-known photographer. Apart from anything else, he's responsible for a book called The Photographer's Eye, which has sold over 1 million copies and has been published in 27 languages. And actually, he tells us this is his 137th book, and no doubt it's the best so far. So he'll be talking about his book, but just briefly before that, his publisher, Mark Fletcher, is going to say a few words about the publishing company, 8 books, of which he is one of the 2 co-founders, along with Damien, who's sitting next to him. So I'll hand straight over to you then, Mark.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to just say a little bit about how we came to publish this book. I've worked in sort of mainstream publishing for rather too long, but many of these sort of books these days, illustrated books, they have to be on very, very general subjects, and publishing a book that's what would define as niche is harder and harder. And this book was something that Michael felt quite passionate about, and I thought would be a wonderful book as well, mainly because he'd done books on sort of design, on general design, and then he showed me some of these tea ceremony rooms in Japan, and I thought it'd be wonderful to create a book just showing 40 examples of these extraordinary interiors, which are sort of quite unique and also very particular in the sense of their aesthetic, and that these are empty rooms that are basically designed for a ceremony. And on the basis of that, we set up the company 8 Books, which we named as a sort of lucky number at Asia. And I'm very pleased that this is actually a new edition. It's an updated edition of this book. And I'm very pleased we were able to publish it again. So over to Michael.
Am I plugged in?
Yes, you are.
Good evening. Give me 1 minute to make sure that the projector's working. Looks like. Yes, good, fine. So, good evening again. This is actually one of the stranger projects that I became involved in. And you might rightly think that few things can be more esoteric than contemporary Japanese tea houses. I mean, tea houses themselves are among the most focused and, well, rule-bound spaces ever devised. and not to be tackled lightly, least of all by someone who knew absolutely nothing about them. And I can't claim to know a great deal more than that even now. But with the confidence of ignorance, I went a step further and chose only contemporary ones, a sort of Japanese new wave. This, however, is what photography can encourage photographers to do. And as a photographer, I'm prone to the belief that my medium can, in some way, tackle everything because its language is different. So that's my excuse for the hubris of tackling this subject. And what you're looking at now, of course, is an entirely traditional tea ceremony room. And I should explain that part of my work, not all of it, is loosely architectural. And I don't see myself as a fully committed architectural photographer. Most of the time I'm doing documentary reportage, stories about people. But I'm very interested in building that's on a human scale, meaning spaces designed for living rather than grand public statements. And this ultimately is what led me to photographing this collection of 40 contemporary tea houses. So at this point, though, I better start using the Japanese term chashitsu, which doesn't translate perfectly into English, mainly for our own English cultural reasons. I mean, tea house is fine, as long as the structure is freestanding, but when, as often nowadays, the space is inside a house or some other building, tea room is not really a very happy translation, conjuring up, at least for me, thoughts of old-fashioned seaside towns and helpings of cucumber sandwiches and scones with jam. But I first became interested in living space, human scale space, in a project almost 30 years ago on the Shakers in America. These were a utopian sect founded in New England in the 19th century. They were a breakaway Quaker movement, actually, immigrants from England. And they were called Shakers in a slightly derogatory way because of their communal and religious-inspired dances. Not exactly whirling dervishes, but sufficiently odd for mainstream Victorian society to regard them as slightly strange. Simplicity, self-sufficiency, and communal living were fundamental to these Shaker communities, which functioned as little villages. But it was abstinence from sex that ensured that all they would leave behind would be their buildings, spaces, and crafts. These two ladies were the last surviving members, and I don't think they were dancing very much. But the Shakers, however, had an aesthetic which would have a predictable revival in the late 20th century. And you can see the appeal of this simplicity. Incidentally, these rails and things hanging on them were because nothing was supposed to be left lying around. When you finish sitting, you could put the chair on the wall. This was not a self-indulgent society. And this was the book that I did. And it was commissioned by one of the great publishing art directors and someone who became a good friend, David Larkin. Now, I'm not going to try and make any facile connections between Shaker rooms, which were austere, as you can see, and Japanese chashitsu. But you could see why the photographic appeal of something like this would also attract me to this. But this isn't exactly why or how the book happened. It rather crept up on me by surprise. And for a year and a half, around the year 2000, I was shooting a book that was to be called Japan Modern, and the subject was new Japanese houses. Now, surprisingly, at the time, there was no such book, just architectural trade magazines. But in the wake of the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble, a new generation of architects and some designers started to rethink the principles of Japanese architecture. People like Ban Shigeru, Kengo Kuma, Kazuo Sejime and Ryo Nishizawa. Many of them were looking back to Japan's long craft traditions to see how they could repurpose these for the modern world, as in this quite well-known building, the M House by Sejime Nishizawa. Inevitably, actually being able to realize these ideas meant for the architects finding private clients of some means. So these were not average houses. And it meant that many of the clients actually had room for a chashitsu and the cultural interest also to want one. This is where it became interesting for me as a photographer, because the architects and designers that I was working with were all imaginative, and they all had their own philosophies and architectural agendas. And naturally, they didn't want just to reproduce traditional chashitsu like this to the usual well-established and rather rigid formulae. They wanted to express themselves. In other words, do their own version. And in house after house, about a third of the ones that I was shooting for this project, I was intrigued and fascinated by, well, characterful tea spaces. This is called Ichijuan. All tea ceremony, all chashitsu have names, by the way. And it's by Shigeru Uchida at the Mojiko Hotel on Kyushu. The hotel was designed by Aldo Rossi. And Uchida went on to experiment more with chashitsu, but what inspired him here was the idea of reducing and simplifying, while at the same time making use of more modern materials like frosted glass. He worked, as he put it, in the belief that the true features of an object are revealed by simplification. And the cover of the book came from this house in Sakuragaoka, designed by Kunihiko Hayakawa. He created a tea ceremony room in what he calls an apparatus, embedding a cylinder into the structure of the building. And the tea ceremony room occupies the upper part. And he designed the room in primary colors. And in place of the tokonoma, the alcove, which is the focal point in many ways of this kind of room, there's simply a polished metal floor section in perforated metal. And the preparation area, the mizuya, is converted from part of the roof terrace outside. And the two glass panels form part of a low wall that rotate on hinges to form a table. So a lot of imaginative structural thought had gone into this. Now, access is in the form of a tubular steel ladder, which can be raised and lowered by means of a wire block pulley. Because one of the, I'm not going to either embarrass myself or bore you with explaining how a traditional chashitsu should work, but one of the features is an extremely small entrance, which translates as wriggling in entrance. The idea being that it makes you humble because you have to crouch down and work your way in. And this was Kayakawa's equivalent. And because it's on a pulley, you can lift it up. So it also offers a sort of isolation. Now, given that the tea ceremony and the space in which it takes place is extraordinarily formal and particular, you might think that this kind of thing was rather brave, if not foolhardy. It's true up to a point, but there are two other dynamics at work. And one is that, in a sense, the chashitsu offers a kind of blank canvas of a space, despite all the traditional strictures. Now, I need to be careful about the words I use here, but in the context of a house, it has none of the normal functions. It's not like a kitchen, bathroom, living room, even study. Now, there are, of course, Japanese rooms that look like chashitsu, but are more informal. But these are washitsu, not so bound by formal constraints. And I was less interested in them, even though there were some very imaginative ones that I did for another book, like this circular structure. And this. Anyway, that wasn't what I was really concentrating on. With the chashitsu, because it has none of the normal living functions of a house and no utilities needed other than a supply of water, there's intrinsically an amount of freedom for the architect. And the second dynamic I found even more interesting. Well, hipster is probably not the first word that comes to mind to do with the Japanese way of tea and the chashitsu. But as one of the designers whose work is featured here said, when Senno Rikyu created his humble style of tea room, it was a direct challenge to the established order and the preference for the expensive, elaborate, and beautiful that held sway at the time. Inevitably, though, what began as an overhaul of tea aesthetics became, again, the established order, with as many rules and restrictions for the tea room as for the practice of the ceremony held in it. At the same time, its relevance to modern Japanese city life has diminished greatly. And this sort of untethering has inspired a growing number of new architects and interior designers to treat the chashitsu as a working space in which to develop new ideas. A sort of contemporary version of what the 16th century tea masters did. So this experimentation actually began in 1983 when an architect, Arata Isozaki, contributed drawings to the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, which was planning an exhibit of follies, international follies. And he decided that a space, as he put it, a space for a non-functional tea ceremony is similar to a folly. So he produced these drawings. And years later, 10 years later, in '92, he was commissioned to actually bring it to reality as this modern chashitsu, which he called Ujian, and it's in Shinagawa. And in particular, he introduced a range of new materials, including titanium, stainless steel, concrete, etched glass, and made a special point of contrast between what he saw as strong, flat, horizontal surfaces and curving feminine verticals. But for many of the, for many of the architects and designers who followed Isozaki, the key was materiality. Choosing material as a theme has run through quite a number of these. And it was, from the beginning, the hallmark of the work of Kengo Kuma, now one of the most famous Japanese architects. And one of his earliest and most spectacular buildings was the water glass house built in Atami. And in the year 2000, when I was starting the book, he was commissioned to build a kind of stone museum in Tochigi Prefecture for a client who quarried the local andesite. And he was looking for ways of making it light, what he calls weak architecture. And his answer was this kind of louvered wall. The site also contained some old small warehouses, which were traditional and solid. And he couldn't do anything with the outside of those, but to continue this theme of making things, making the stone lighter, he took one of them to make out of it an experimental chashitsu. For the rest of the area, what he'd had to do was experiment with new cutting techniques to make thin slices of stone. And he put this to use here, creating these thin slats. More than that, they were treated by subjecting them to extremes of heat, which alters the color. The precise hue of this volcanic stone depends on the temperature. So combining it with sliding shoji screens and a raised floating tatami floor with underlighting, the result was the lightness that he was looking for. Another experiment in materials was the use of steel, and some of it rusted or partly oxidized. And here's in Osaka by, I've forgotten the name of the architect, but it's in the book. And it's called the probably no Tetsuo no Chashitsu, which simply means the steel sheet tea room. Here's another case. In one of the oldest temples in the historic town of Kawagoi, I pronounced that right, architect Ken Yokogawa won a competition to install a tea room that had to blend old and new within the grounds of the temple. So he used etched glass walls, one of them creating what's essentially a backlit tokonoma, the alcove, and laid over them specially designed handmade Japanese rice paper. And he used aluminium and glass for the entrance and a Brazilian hardwood as a kind of open work roof, because the existing trees had to be left. So he simply cut circular holes for them. The final stepping stone, there's always one for a tea ceremony where you take your shoes off, is actually of sheets of baked frosted glass that have been layered and then finally chiseled. So you can see a lot of these people are experimenting with materials. And this I particularly like, the sukubai, the stone water basin. You basically cut it in half vertically and then reassembled it, sandwiching a thick sheet of glass. The theme here in open farmland near Narita Airport is sustainable low energy architecture using glass and rough wood. And these 4 large greenhouses enclose an eco village with small raised dwelling units in wood, and the project's called Millennium City. The architect, Hiroshi Iguchi, made one of these units into a tea house. And the box construction of the unit with these braces is in Japanese cedar, and replacing the normal paper shoji screens, acrylic panels. Another material, paper. This room is called Seifuan, and the architect is Atsushi Kitagawara. And it's in Sendagaya. He built this tea ceremony room for his own use, in a kind of modern free-form version of what he still considers a Sukiya humble style, using natural materials, chief of which is hand-laid washi paper, crumpled and rolled. And the ceiling is covered entirely with the paper rolled around bamboo tubes. And there's neither a tokonoma nor a hanging scroll painting, as he and his wife preferred a sort of relaxed and informal style of tea ceremony. So his idea was to place against one wall whatever he thought would be appropriate for his guests. And this is where I learned something important about the tea ceremony that I hadn't quite realized before, because I'd always seen it as something very daunting, and you get your wrist slapped if you turn the cup the wrong way around and things like that. Knowing that I was coming to photograph it, he insisted on, he and his wife, preparing a tea ceremony for me. And so we spent quite some time thinking about what to place in this sort of blank tokonoma. So instead of a scroll, he chose a framed print by a photographer friend of his. And I was very, very touched by that. I suddenly realized that there was more to the tea ceremony than just going through rules. It's very much about hospitality. And I came to learn a phrase, ichigo ichie, which is one time, one meeting. It's never going to happen again. The person you've invited, this moment, is unique. So I was very touched by that. Anyway, back to materials. Aluminium became almost, well, actually an obsession for designer Toshihiko Suzuki, who became a friend, beginning with his atelier in the countryside of Yamagata. It extends to an old Airstream trailer, which he uses as the mizuya, the preparation space, for his aluminium chashitsu, which uses aluminium honeycomb. These are 2 solid sheets sandwiching a honeycomb core. And the result was this, soan, which simply means simple, in the form of a cube. And this is the room that graces the cover of our book. There's concealed interior lighting, and it's computer controlled so that it cycles up and down while daylight filters through the circular holes. Anyway, that was pretty conventional actually compared with what he went on to next, which was the idea of a sort of large flat suitcase, just about portable. Now this in fact wasn't, this first example was not for the tea ceremony, but it unfolds to reveal a tatami mat in traditional igusat straw, and we can see it in work here. So he used the same honeycomb aluminium for strength. And here's one of his assistants. I mean, you might wonder how she actually carried it into the woods. Well, we all helped. But this is how you put it together. And this was basically a sort of meditation space. So and it had quite a complex structural arrangement of these aluminium tubes and elasticated shock cords, which are then erected to produce 4 triangular sails as a sort of light ceiling. And the superstructure, believe it or not, is based on Buckminster Fuller's tensegrity principle, in which tension is used primarily and compression secondarily. That's the way Suzuki explained it to me, and I didn't quite understand, but never mind. But the result was obviously quite useful. But he took this idea and then extended it to make a slightly larger version that would actually function as a portable tea ceremony room. Completely functional, by the way, for 1 tea master and 1 guest, as you will see. And there we go. If this seems a little weird, well, it is weird, but it's really weird. Suzuki actually said, but the original chashitsu were indeed portable. They could be disassembled and moved. So they were the earliest examples of architecture as furniture, in his way of seeing it, which is the area of ambiguity, he said, that I'm exploring here. Well, good. But portability is a theme also explored by veteran designer Shigeru Uchida with this structure called Sankyo, meaning in the mountains. This was the sort of launch party for it, the vernissage, like. So I didn't actually get to see it in the mountains. And this is the 5th of his portable series. It's made of bamboo mesh supported by a frame of Japanese ash, stained black. And he calls it movable architecture. And also, with the materials, it straddles the border between inside and outside, which is an area of fascination that many Japanese architects have. Now, I've been talking about the tokonoma, which is traditionally an alcove, key focal point for a tea room, and in particular, should be featuring a flower arrangement and a hanging scroll. So remember the first chashitsu I showed you in the cover of the book in blue, red, and yellow, where that was replaced just by a small flooring of polished aluminium. So for modern versions, it almost always comes under scrutiny by the designer or architect because he's having to deal with this essentially very traditional focal point. So here, Uchida just used a small image of a horse, but there were some more experimental approaches. Now, in this house in Osaka, this is by a team. The architect's Chitoshi Kihara, but he works a lot with garden designer Yasujiro Aoki, who's a friend. They often work together, and they devised a very different approach. Their argument was that the scroll painting for the tokonoma should be chosen with great care. Remember how in the one that I attended, a lot of thought had gone into producing something that I would like, the photograph, but also should be changed with the season. Now, Kihara's idea, there isn't really time in modern city life to attend to all these things very easily. So instead, they made the view through the drawn back shoji screens as the equivalent of a scroll. So this is how it works. In the trough outside are these black pebbles, with a plant arrangement at the far end and a small mound of larger stones close to the camera. And here's the view from the other end. And as you can see, the trough can be filled with water at the flick of a switch. Well, you just have to wait about half an hour to fill up, but still it's easy enough to do and easily emptied. So the idea is to allow a kind of change of landscape that takes the place of seasonal change. But let's go further. Another creative approach to a traditional idea involves the old garden concept of borrowed landscape. It's a slightly complicated story before we get to the tokonoma, but please bear with me. Borrowed landscape, Jiejing in Chinese, Shake in Japanese. It originated in China, and here's one very well-known example in the city of Suzhou. This is Zhujian Yuan, the humble administrator's garden, which is probably the most famous of the old gardens in the city, built in 1509. And it uses the Besa North Temple pagoda as part of the design. It borrows it in. It's exactly 1 kilometer distant. Now, this idea of borrowed landscape is fascinating. And it's extremely difficult to do nowadays because you don't have much control over what's happening in the distance. Next year there might be a wind farm, and that could certainly spoil your garden design. But we did come across a very imaginative one in Okinawa, and it's called the Watergate House. And it was designed by the combination of the owner and the architect. The architect, young guy Tetsuo Goto. The owner, very well-known theatre and film director called Amon Minamoto. And the idea was to choose a view that wasn't going to be messed around with by the municipality or anyone else. And that was really easy to find in Okinawa, and easy to buy land for building on the coast because of the typhoons, no one in their right mind builds on the coast. But the inspiration for the house was this view of the seashore. And Minamoto, being a theatre director, he conceived the idea of a proscenium. So because of the way the bedding of the seashore is quite shallow, and it's rock and extends out a long way when the tide's down, the view's constantly changing. And of course, key to this is this rock in front, and it looks, just like a rock, but actually, it's quite a large boulder out in the sea. And so when the guests actually get up and walk out, it becomes a surprising experience. But Minamoto and Goto weren't finished there, because they decided also to use this for the tea room, but in a different way. Minamoto is a theatrical director, but he explained that he was taken with the idea of a priest opening and closing a sliding door to reveal briefly a view beyond. And as a child, he'd always wanted to like the idea of a tea ceremony room that actually looked out. So this is what they did. They sited the room to the right of the main living area. It's in concrete, roofless concrete. And they made a narrow window so that you just see the water and the slope of the rock. And And so, just to labour the point, excuse me, it's a real-life version of a shan shui mountain water landscape, which would traditionally hang in the tokonoma, either that or calligraphy. And the ledge in front, coated in red lacquer, just has a single shallow circular depression, and the flower arrangement is always a single floating bloom. So I thought that was quite lovely. I'm going to finish with one of my favorite Japanese architects, Terunobu Fujimori. In fact, he began not as an architect, but as a teacher. He was professor of architectural history at Todai. And this, which is called a Nira house, which means, it translates literally as leek, but actually it's Chinese chives. It's the ones that go into gyoza. And this was an early work of his, and it incorporated a chashitsu on the right there. And he designed it for his friend, an artist and novelist called Genpei Akasagawa. And between them, they came up with the idea of planting 1,000 pots of chives on the roof, which called for quite a complex system of irrigation under the wooden roof. And as for the chashitsu, it has its own quirkiness because the roof is firewood. And not only that, but it was entirely assembled by the architect, the owner, and a group of friends in one day. And they made an installation event out of it. Now the wriggling in entrance is particularly difficult and precarious. It's just under the eaves of the main living area. And that's quite high, by the way, it's slightly dangerous. But after this came Kuan. This is a construction for a small temple in Kyoto. And originally, this corner, in the far corner there, had an outside toilet. But once a new flush lavatory had been built inside the temple, the resident priest, Hitoshi Akino, who unfortunately recently died, asked Fujimori, who was a friend, to design a tea house which he, the priest, would actually build himself. And he did. And this was the result. Fujimori had the idea of a sort of perched construction, like a small tea house, a tree house rather, using a branch and forks of a chestnut tree from his own hometown. So the result is a kind of sort of elven construction. It wouldn't really look out of place in Tolkien's Middle-earth. But he then later took this further, and this is the last picture I'm going to show you. And this became Fujimori's signature building, which he called, not entirely tongue-in-cheek, Takasugiyam, which roughly translates as too high, the too high tea house. And it's in his native Chino in Nagano Prefecture, and it deliberately sways in the wind. As he puts it, it's his hideout in the treetops. So with that, I can see that I've run over slightly. I will now attempt to answer any questions, but if anyone asks me anything technical about either the way of tea or the way these things should be built, I'm afraid I will deflect the answer. We could turn the lights up. Yeah, great.
This is not an architectural question, but with such radical tea houses, how radical are the tea bowls which are at the centre of the tea ceremony?
I debated putting in some pictures of tea bowls, and they weren't radical enough, if that answers the question. But you know, that's an area that I haven't really explored, and it could be. But I think I was actually in Japan. I was in Uji, near Kyoto, in the summer, photographing at a kiln which is now run by the 70th generation. Because I've just finished a book on tea in China, Taiwan, and Japan mainly, and they're making bowls, and he's a young guy, but in terms of, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think on my feet of a useful answer. I think it's because the world of ceramics is probably a little different. The people who were trying to break out here were young architects, and quite often young starting architects, starting at the time, which is how they get to do houses rather than sort of large municipal buildings, and designers who by nature want to make a mark. So I don't know, I will investigate. Good question, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, right. Just wondering how often these spaces actually get used for the tea ceremony. Do you think these people are frequently doing that, or are they using them for meditation spaces, or just to show people the clever stuff they design?
It was been rude to actually ask, but I suspect less often for the real purpose. I think they like the idea of the space that was the space was created architecturally with character, rather than using it very much, I suspect.
Any more questions?
I can't have answered everything. No?
No?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Did you see anything that you would like to incorporate into your own home here?
My home has very little room. Very little spare room indeed. Swinging a cat doesn't come into it. We are indeed doing major works, which means major works on the scale of a few feet, on the roof. You'd need to have some land in order to indulge yourself with this. So
your garden, Michael. Do you have?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say this, because I was in Fujimori. He's really on a roll with these now, because I pitched up in Taiwan in May, and we'd just come from Tokyo, and Suzuki, the guy who does the aluminium briefcases, right? He'd shown me, because he works with Fujimori, he'd shown me a picture of another sort of high perched tree house that he'd done in central Taiwan. And then it turned out that the people I knew in Taipei, well, one of them had actually paid for it, so we went down to photograph it. And I thought, with that and the other one, which I don't know the picture of, I thought that would actually be really good in our garden. Mainly because it's high enough that it wouldn't interfere with the actual garden. But unfortunately, just never got around to it. And of course, but I had to shelve the idea the day before yesterday, because there's we have in these little terrace houses that go in a block, so we've all got our little gardens in the middle, and there's a beautiful, I discovered the name of it now, a robinia, which has these sort of very bright yellow-green leaves, and they just cut it down because the neighbour on the other side rather ungenerously decided it was interfering with her light. So unfortunately, that put paid to that secret idea that I was entertaining.
Any questions?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking more about the way that you work on your projects. This has been ongoing for quite a few years. How do you work? Are the projects intertwined, or do you focus on a book and then get it done and come back to it? How do you work?
I like the last idea. The last idea is a really good one because it means that you can actually wrap it up and concentrate. And to be honest, that's normally what happens. But in the course of doing one book, and I travel a lot for my work, I mean, as you see, things crop up, and you may see something or photograph something that hasn't anything directly to do with the current project, but it could be the start of another project. So take the picture, put it to one side. And ultimately, that's the way that this one happened. I was doing something else and then found that I was coming across these strange rooms. So finally decided that that's another book. So went back to finish it off. There's a lot of serendipity in photography, which is sort of, that's photographer speak for meaning chaotic. Yes, sure.
Because I think Britain has much stricter building restrictions, whereas in Japan you can basically come up with any ideas or designs and you can just build a house. Whereas in Britain, I think you have to get permission.
This is an area of my expertise. Having started in the spring to repair our roof, which is called there's a name for it. It's called a London something. Anyway, it's a picture of the butterfly, which has the gutter in the middle of the house, which of course is a recipe for disaster, and disaster struck after 25 years. And actually getting permission to turn it into an ordinary flat roof was, in fact, it was so daunting, we didn't ask. Well, I was relying on an old Chinese saying, which is forgiveness is easier to get than permission. So we went ahead and did it until the you asked. I'll tell you the story now. And then I discovered that it's also the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea who are well known for their somewhat conservative views. I mean, the chances of having optical fibre in the borough are minimal because they don't like the shape of BT's boxes. So I discovered there's a job description at the council called what's the planning enforcement officer, right? And as they say, and they use Google Earth, by the way. They scour for things that have been happening out of normal street view. So the net result was that they are just about to forgive us, but they certainly won't allow us the 3-inch extra brick course that I want. So yes, so I don't think Fujimura would have the greatest opportunities in Kensington and Chelsea.
Tea house would be almost impossible, even in your own garden in this country.
Especially in your own garden. Very good point.
So I was just saying, it's very like some things I've seen at Chelsea Flower Show. They have these things up there for people who live in the country with massive gardens.
And also they're going to come down in a couple of weeks.
Probably. Is that still standing?
Yes, it is. So he does these on commission now.
Usually this strict kind of control on designing houses in this country affected the British architects.
That's not a question I'm qualified to answer.
I can say it does. Well, I have to know this because within Kensington and Chelsea at the moment, they've just changed the size of the basements that can be designed. So
have they changed the depth to which they can be?
They changed the amount of space you go, and I know my husband is an architect, designed a double basement 3 years ago, and now no longer can. But that might not be a bad thing for those people who live next to people.
Well, I mean,
basements.
those things go down.
Yeah.
It's not just a case of, are you having a swimming pool built in the basement, or are you having two on different levels? In fact, I was I was amused to find a picture of mine, a photograph of mine, actually used in Abramovich's planning application for construction in, what was it, Ken? What's the millionaire's row? What's the real name of that? No, it's the one, Kingston Palace Road, Palace Gardens, yeah. It was very weird. It was in page 3 of the Standard. My editor pointed it out. Isn't that one of yours? And it was a picture of City Hall subway station in New York, which is quite high level. It's near where the Twin Towers were, and it was closed in the 1940s because of the bend. But anyway, it has this lovely vaulting with skylights, and the architects actually put that in the planning application for the kind of feeling they wanted for the underground swimming pool. Well, we can continue if anyone has sort of questions they want to ask more privately. We can continue over drinks.
Yeah. I can see we're going to spend most of the rest of the evening discussing planning permission. We've all got stories on that front. Okay, well, just before we sort of formally thank you, can I mention we've got one more event this year, which is next Monday, and it's Eleanor Grammage, who is a Daiwa scholar who was in Japan. I suppose she got back about a year ago. And she is a novelist and is introducing her new book, which is called, I think, The Woman Who Brings the Rain, and describes her time in Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. So I don't know, some of you may have been to our other Daiwa scholar event, which was the Clockmaker of Filigree Street, which was Natasha Pulley. She gave a talk about that book, which has sold very well, by the way. But Eleanor is a very different type of writer. So the Clockmaker of Filigree Street is kind of fantasy, historical fantasy, and Eleanor is much more sort of very gentle, like Kawabata style, very subtle writing, at least what I've read of her. So she's speaking on Monday, and just so you don't get caught out, that event is at 7 p.m, not our usual time of 6 p.m. So we're going to go downstairs now. We're going to have a drink. We have copies of the book. The Daiwa Foundation is not involved in the commercial aspect of this at all, but there are copies of the book, and they're on sale for £15, which to me looks like a bargain. They're beautifully produced, actually. So if you want to buy them and indeed get them signed, I think you're taking cash and credit cards, which is more advanced than we can usually manage.
Actually, sorry, the books are free. It's just a signature that costs £15.
Haven't signed them all yet. Better get on and do them all.
Can I just have a book then? So anyway, on that note, please come downstairs. It's one floor down in our gallery floor. Have a glass of wine, and do ask any further questions to Michael, for whom many thanks indeed for a fascinating talk. One other thing I've been asked to mention, down in our gallery floor, you'll find a post box, which is called the Missing Post Office. And it's part of an art project that we're involved with. But the idea is that if you've got things you want to say to people, but you can't, for whatever reason, send a letter to the person directly, for instance, because they are deceased or whatever, you send your letter or postcard to this missing post box, and it will be kept there for as long as it takes for the person to claim it. Of course, could be forever. And we're having an art exhibition based on that in January. So we could do with a few more sort of anonymously addressed postcards and letters, if you wouldn't mind.
Go downstairs and start drinking.